All right, welcome to Ancient Greek Philosophy, Part 4. Today we are going to just speak very briefly about a large work that Plato wrote called The Republic. And I'm going to focus primarily on the opening of that book, which kind of talks about the concept of education. And then we're going to skip to the opening of Book 7 of The Republic, which gives us that very famous Allegory of the cave, which helps us to understand the concept of the theory of the forms just a little bit better. In the beginning of the Republic, Socrates is going to be doing what Socrates does through this process of Socratic method. He's going to come forward into the streets and start asking questions. And specifically, he raises the question, what is justice? Now, I think it's worth noting that in the Greek, the word that's used here is dikasune, which implies justice in the sense of morality. What is the morally right or the morally correct course of action? But he begins this conversation raising this question, what is justice? And he says, I have no idea what it is, but I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to get to the core definition, the core understanding of what justice is. And so one of his interlocutors, Thrasymachus, comes along, and he basically says, well, justice is whatever is in the interest of the stronger party. All right, whatever is in the interest of the stronger party. Whoever holds the power, they decide what is just and what is unjust. Simple as that. And so if you are in a democracy like Athens, then it's the people that determine justice. If you are in Corinth, then the king might determine justice. If you're in Sparta, then the dictator might determine justice. Whoever holds the power decides what justice is. Well, Socrates is not going to accept that for the simple reason that all that is doing is giving us some specific examples of justice. We're not concerned with discovering specific examples of justice. We want that absolute, unchanging form, that ideal definition of justice. And so as we learned last time, when we're looking at this theory of the forms, there are lots of examples of things, just as there are many different people, many different cats, many different tables in the world, but it's that ultimate unchanging form that he was interested in. The same is true of these moral concepts. And so there's lots of examples of justice, but none of those are really the core definition. So eventually, Socrates, in putting together his own definition of justice, he says simply that justice is a form that participates in the good. Now, we've almost wrapped our head around the idea of what a form is from our previous video. But what is the good? Well, the good is essentially a combination of all of the positive virtues working together with each other. And so justice, benevolence, compassion, and so on, all of these various positive virtues, each one working together in a solitary unit so that they can complement each other. You see, when you have a concept like justice by itself, autoto dikasune, justice according to itself, then that's something that can be very rigid, very absolute. But if that justice, for example, were tempered with benevolence, then it could be a little more fair, a little more just in and of itself. As an example, suppose that you have two people in a kitchen, and one of them just simply picks up a knife and stabs the other without provocation. That's scenario one. Scenario two, you have two people in a kitchen. The one is going to pick up a knife and stab the other, but within that situation, there's been a long history of physical violence, a long history of abuse. And so this person who acted out and stabbed the other was doing so perhaps because they'd been driven to it, or perhaps out of self-defense in this particular instance. Now, if you're looking simply at justice according to itself, then there's no difference between those two cases. Someone was stabbed, and whatever penalty the one gets for that, the other would get also. But once we look at the good, and we see justice in companionship with benevolence, with compassion, with these other virtues, then we can see that the one is deserving of a much harsher penalty than the other one is, because there were mitigating circumstances that led the second one to their act. The first one is an act of murder one. The second one is possibly self-defense. So this is the concern, is we want to follow, according to Plato, justice or any other virtue in terms of its absolute nature, but also to recognize that they work together, and that is what is meant by this concept of the good. Now, of course, most people don't realize this, and so Plato says that what we're going to have to do is to establish some kind of educational system that is going to lead towards producing leaders that understand the good, that understand the forms, people who are in knowledge of the ultimate truth, whereas the vast majority of us are caught up in this illusion of the world. And so Plato is going to actually do something pretty remarkable for his time period. He proposes that if we were to establish this republic, this ideal political state that he's trying to get at, that what we would have to do is to establish a system of free education for the masses. Now, it's going to come in several different stages, and it will produce the various classes or the various castes of society. So from the age of 7 to 20, every citizen of Plato's Republic should be allowed this education. In terms of this education, about half of it would be devoted towards mental pursuits, the other half towards physical pursuits. At the end of that process, those that had made it to this point but no further, they become the bronze caste of society. It's their job to become the laborers, to become the workers. But Plato says we have to remember that these are the backbone of society. Without these individuals, we don't eat, because there are no crops being tended. Because of these, we have no safety, because there is no military to look after us. And so they are the backbone of society, very crucial, very important individuals, even though they are essentially going to be caught up in the illusions of the world. But those that look like they could go further with their education will carry on for another 10 years, from the age of 20 to 30. Now, those that make it that far but no further, they will become the silver caste. These will be your low-level magistrates, some business leaders, things of that nature. But those rare few who look like they could go on even further are going to carry on their studies from the age of 30 to 50. And the ones who make it to that position, to that point, become the gold caste. These are the people who will understand the truth, because in those last 20 years, the physical goes by the wayside. The mental becomes something that is absolute and unchanging. The mental is going to be where the focus is. And so these are the people who are going to come to not only understand the theory of the forms, but to embrace it as the absolute truth. And so they are the ones who will see the reality rather than the illusion. They are the ones who will be in a position to be able to be the leaders of society, the people who can guide the rest of us along the way so that we don't hurt ourselves too badly with our ignorance. And so the valedictorian of the class, if you will, would become the philosopher, king or queen. And the rest would make up the privy council for that monarch, for that ruler. And so what Plato is advocating for is essentially an intellectual aristocracy. Remember that unlike Socrates, Plato despised the idea of democracy. It's nothing more than the mob rule of the ignorant, largely probably because of the fact that it was democracy that put Socrates to death, and he never forgave them for that. But he also felt that the best form of government for us would be an aristocracy, an intellectual aristocracy, whereby the ruling elite would be those who had the intelligence to see the truth and to guide us along the proper path, whereas the rest of us were caught up in ignorance. As he says here, there will be no end to the troubles of states or of humanity itself, till philosophers become kings in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, and political power and philosophy thus come into the same hands. It's also, I think, very interesting that Plato does specify that this top leader could be a philosopher king or a philosopher queen. We know that in the ancient world, women were not looked upon very highly. They certainly were not perceived as intellectually minded individuals. But yet Plato, in being consistent with his theory, recognizes that the same bit of that collective soul from the realm of being that goes into a male body in one incarnation could go into a female body in the other. And so male or female, we still have access to that same absolute knowledge, that same absolute truth. We still have that same capacity for linking to it. And so if given the opportunities, either male or female could become that great intellectual leader. And so not only was Plato perhaps a very early advocate for universal education, but he was also one of the early advocates for feminism, recognizing the validity that women too had the capacity to govern, the capacity to lead. If we move on, the other concept, which is related, of course, but the other concept that I wanted to get to today was Plato's Allegory of the Cave. This is one of the most famous concepts, one of the most famous passages to come out of Plato's writings, and it's found in Book 7 of the Republic. And now I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open towards the light and reaching all along the den. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads. Above and behind them a fire is blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there's a raised way, and you will see if you look a low wall built along the way, like the screens which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. And do you see, I said, men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials which appear over the wall? Some of them are talking, others are silent. You have shown me strange images, and they are strange prisoners. Like ourselves, I replied, and they see only their shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. Basically, what's happening here is we're being brought into a sort of thought experiment. Let's imagine that we have this underground cave, and we take these individuals, and since birth, they've been trapped inside of this cave, chained up in such a way that they cannot look around to see each other. They can only look forward. And these individuals come in, you can see in the image there, right? Here's this fire that is there. There's sunlight from coming in from the outside, perhaps a little bit, but mostly the fire. And then people come forward and they bring in these images that produce shadows on the wall. Now, because these prisoners have known no other life, no other existence rather than this one, they believe this to be reality. They believe it to be the truth. They accept that the world is only as large as the cave that they are in. They accept that the two-dimensional dark images on the wall are reality. That's what things are. And of course, if people make sounds or speak, it's going to be echoed. It's going to be altered because of the cave. And so they come to accept that that is reality too. They will probably, even though they can't look around to see each other, they will probably perhaps feel or recognize that there's someone else with them. And so they'll need to develop language. They'll need to begin speaking about the things that they're seeing, communicating with each other. And so they will probably make up all kinds of names for the images and things that are on the wall that have nothing to do with the reality of what they are. And so these individuals are trapped there, knowing no other life, knowing no other existence other than that one. And so they come to accept it. They embrace it. This is truth. This is reality. Well, the allegory is that life inside the cave, as strange as it sounds, that's the world that we're all in. This world that we're living in is just like that cave. We're being shown these shadowy images. We're being shown the illusions of this world, these fleeting, changing things. We have no direct access to the reality or to the truth because that dwells in that other realm, in that realm of being. So life inside the cave is the realm of becoming. Life inside the cave is what our world is. We are being fed images that we accept as real without recognizing that they are simply fleeting, changing things. The language that we make up to speak about those things has nothing at all to do with the reality of it. You know, when I use a word like table or cat or tree or even justice, these terms don't have any direct link to the reality of what is. They are just social constructs that we've used, that we've created, so that we can speak to each other about certain things within this fantasy. Now, Plato says, what happens then? Let's imagine that we're going to take one of these individuals here, and we're going to set him free from his bonds, and we're going to drag him quickly up here out into the light of day. Now, when that happens, of course, at first he's going to go blind because he's lived his life inside this dark cave, and now all of a sudden he's out in this big, bright, open world. And that sunlight, that brightness is going to blind him. When his vision starts to clear, it's going to be sort of hazy, sort of fuzzy, and that might lead him to believe that he's in some kind of dream state. And then he begins to see the world around him. And he says, how can this possibly be reality? This is strange. I mean, this world I'm looking at, it's full of vibrant colors. There's all this three-dimensionality. Things sound differently. They look differently. I can see for what would amount to miles and miles. That can't be reality. And so he's going to mistakenly believe that what he's seeing now is some kind of made-up nonsense, that this is the fantasy, and he's going to want to go back inside that cave. He's going to want to go back to what he is familiar with, back to what he knows, because we do have a tendency to want to seek that which is comfortable, even if it means turning our back on something that is perhaps better. So turning our back sometimes on the truth. And so he's going to want to go back inside that cave, back to be locked up again. But here's the thing. Once he has been outside, once he has seen that other realm, it's going to produce this little nagging, questioning doubt inside the back of his mind. Did he make the right choice? Did he make the right decision? Did he come back to the reality and leave that fantasy behind, or has he gotten stuck inside this trapped world, and out there is the reality? What is the truth? And once that nagging, doubting sensation takes hold of him, He's going to work very hard to find out the truth. And so he's going to eventually then break his own bonds and begin to explore the area around him, perhaps now for the first time, seeing the other figures and allowing them to see him, which is going to produce, maybe a question or doubt within their minds. He will examine the wall that is in front of them that's been showing these images all this time. He'll find his own way up this steep ascent and discover the fire and the people, the players, the objects that they're using. He'll make his way slowly out into the daylight, out into the light of day, and explore that world as well. And so little by little, he will come to realize that this life inside of the cave was the illusion, that this life inside of the cave, that somebody has been trying to trick him, has been trying to feed him fantasy his entire life. And now, for the first time, he's discovered that reality. He's discovered that truth. But you'll notice that this process has to take place slowly over time. And that's why, going back to the earlier discussion, the educational process takes so long. I mean, if you think about making it to that stage of the philosopher, king or queen, that's 43 years of education. Because it's not enough to do what we do and simply say, here's the theory of the forms, here's how it works, great, I understand the theory. You can't do it that way. You have to actually come not just to understand it as a theory, but to understand it and accept it as the truth. To be willing to say that everything you have known your entire life has been nothing but illusion, and that only now are you seeing the reality? That our world, our realm of becoming, our changing, fleeting world is no more real than that cave? And that reality is that realm of being that lies outside. And so again, within the analogy, inside the cave is the realm of becoming, outside the cave, the realm of being, right? And so we need to work through that process to where we too can stand in the light of day, where we can discover that truth, where we can discover that reality. This idea of the allegory of the cave is a very famous one, and it's one that many thinkers have built upon. And one of the more recent and more popular views of it is from a film that came out in 1999 called The Matrix. And the Coen brothers, who helped bring The Matrix to life, essentially were giving us a modern day take on the view of Plato's allegory of the cave, also Descartes' evil deceiver argument, which is another variation or another version upon it. If you're familiar with the film, you know that Neo is sort of the Socrates character, that's Keanu Reeves' character. And in the beginning of the film, he finds himself believing that he is living in our modern world, end of the 20th century and so on. Everything is going along. But he begins to notice that there are certain problems, certain glitches, certain things that don't seem quite right. And so we discover as the film goes on that actually it's a few hundred years later than what he thinks it is. The world has been conquered by these aliens, and humanity is essentially, like you see in the image there, sitting in this vat of goo with electrodes attached to them, being fed these images of this life at the end of the 20th century, so that they don't realize that they are effectively being harvested. Morpheus, who you see on the other side there, is going to come to Neo and basically giving him this option. If you take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Do you take the red pill or do you take the blue pill? Are you going to go back inside of the illusion? Or are you going to stay here and see the truth? Are you going to see the reality of what the world actually is, rather than the fantasy? And there are a lot of people who obviously are not going to be willing to go back into it. a lot of people that are not going to effectively be willing to go back in there and to say, hey, I don't want that truth. That truth is scary. That truth is too odd. I want what I'm familiar with. You know, the character of Cypher in the film is going to represent that. You know, I mean, he has been out in the real world, but it's a terrible place, right? The way that things are after the alien takeover, living this life of exile, trying to, you know, face the rebellion, lead the rebellion. All of that is just terrible. And he says, look, I know that it's an illusion, but I want to go back inside of this matrix. I want to go back in, be a person of value, sit down and enjoy a good meal, you know, instead of eating this little bowl of snot that's in front of me. So, you know, Morpheus is there to represent that figure to help guide us. Cypher is the one who can't make it, the ignorant mass, the one who's going to need to be looked after, you know, those of us trapped inside. Neo is the great Socrates. He's the one who is going to stand outside, who will come to learn to manipulate the matrix. And what we'll see when we get into the symposium is that this is exactly the way that Socrates was. You know, just as Neo could bend reality around him in the film, Socrates, you know, for example, is going to go into this drinking party, drink everybody under the table, and walk away completely unfazed by it, because the things of the material world have no bearing or effect on him, because he mentally understands that they are irrelevant, that they are not the truth. And that reality, you know, is something very different. And so Socrates, in a way, like Neo, has that capacity to control the illusion. But the hard part is making the decision to take the red pill. The hard part is deciding to stay outside of the cave, because our mentality is that we want to do what is comfortable. We want to stick with what we know. And this has implications, of course, in our modern world too. You know, many times individuals will pass up opportunities for advancement, opportunities to learn new things, opportunities for great growth, because they don't want to leave behind what was known, what was comfortable. How many times have people been given an opportunity to say, you know, hey, if you move to this other city, we're going to give you this big promotion. You'll have this nice office. You'll have all these advancements. But yet this person's going to turn it down because, well, I've never lived anywhere else than here. I don't know that place. I'm going to stick with what I know, even if what you know isn't as good. And so it takes a very brave, very bold individual to be able to take that leap of faith, to be able to make that jump, to embrace something beyond that which is comfortable. In essence, that's what Socrates does when he agrees, you know, to the concept of death. We talked before about how when he was sentenced to death, he was accepting of it. He was looking forward to it because it meant that he would know finally what the truth was. He could escape the illusion. Most people, even if their life is not that great, is going to be afraid to take that leap because they don't know what's there. They don't know what the truth is. And so they're going to want to do everything they can to cling on. But Socrates will make that jump. He'll make that leap. All right. Well, that is going to do it with our brief look at the Republic. I hope you've enjoyed that. On another video, we'll take a look at Plato's Symposium.